A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to HJN Season 4, or in this case, Super Graphix, which is, of course, a series which I talk about video games, just like in the case of Original Graphix, which I did back in 2021. But for this case, after having lots to talk about a certain series, getting back to singular stories, or in the case of singular games with no sequels at the moment or otherwise, I might as well go on ahead and take advantage of something different for number 2583. For this case, let's go ahead and talk a bit about a certain ultra-violence series from 1987 to the very present. Robocop. Yeah, that's right. If you might remember, in late 2023, Nacon brought along a brand new Robocop game for us to try. And not too long ago, I actually had played through it myself, so the game itself is pretty fresh in my mind. The unique experience of an FPS-based game with the ability to play as our favorite titular cyber defender himself of Detroit, Michigan, Robocop, that's an extensive idea that has actually gone way back to the days when Robocop was first around. And with various games coming along on various PCs, consoles, and etc., it eventually seemed fitting that we would have to get another console release. Basically, for a lot of us new-gen players, it seemed that a brand new Robocop game would be fitting to allow for us to get the first-hand experience of controlling Robocop and interacting with the many characters and environments from the movies, the shows, and whatnot. But we finally have that experience, all thanks to the wonders of Nacon. It wasn't anything like OG or Game Mill or Microids or anybody else who was well known for creating some not so great things in regarding movie titled licensed games by any means. But Nacon did things way differently. The plot is immense, long, chaotic, and certainly packed with loads of social satire, violence, and drama. The characters are all well represented and are all fit in to the plot, except for those that were actually killed off, because this game, believe it or not, does in fact try to fit in throughout the timeline of the original trilogy. Supposedly, it takes place between parts 2 and 3. Basically, the times where a street drug known as Nuke was around. As the second film gave us, it was a red liquid which caused certain highs to develop in many super criminals all over Detroit itself. But as we know, the kingpin responsible for the manufacture and distribution of Nuke itself, known as Kane, was killed off by OCP and had his brain transplanted into the one and only Robocop 2. In the case of Rogue City, though, this does take place after those events, but Nuke was still in full swing regarding production and or sales amongst many criminal empires, including a few that I'll get to in a bit. In terms of the story, we'll first start off with a certain news broadcast from Channel 9, which has had many appearances all throughout the Robocop films, even has the same anchor himself. Unfortunately, mid-broadcast, the anchor and the rest of the news team inside the station are interrupted by a gang known as the Torchheads. Their leader, Soot, decides to take the seat and cover the anchor, in a way, by simply allowing for his message for Nuke production, distribution, and whatnot to take place. And in doing so, the response of the Detroit Police Department, especially from the likes of Sergeant Reed and Robocop himself, along with his partner Ann Lewis, certainly came on through. A response was eventually relayed from Sergeant Reed and the rest of the Detroit Police Department himself. Robocop, as well as his partner Ann Lewis, decide to investigate. They go into the tower, shooting up all the criminals they see. And when we take advantage of Robocop himself, it's a first-person shooter, basically. That's pretty much all we do in this instance. The main gameplay is based around shooting enemies down, collecting evidence, as well as rescuing hostages. There's also a variety of other activities that we do get to take advantage of, but that doesn't really happen until later in the game. By any means, though, what I will say regarding the game itself, even including the famous Robocop theme song from the first film, as we gun down the loads of torch heads that are inside the news station. And as we make our way all the way to the top floor, in which that we encounter more torch heads and eventually rescue the hostages inside the anchor room itself, Robocop basically encounters a certain hostage situation. And while the torch head is taken down, that mostly happened because of Lewis. It seems that because of Robocop's hesitation to save the hostage from that torch head, it led to some pretty bad blood in the public eye. And so that's basically where Omni Consumer Products, or OCP for short, went on ahead and sent in a specialist to monitor Robocop's activities, even going so far as to plant a chip in his brain. They also employ a psychologist in order to have him evaluated, discuss his emotional stature, and also work out a solution so that way his past doesn't come back to haunt him in the future. But we'll talk a bit more about this past that he's had to live with for the rest of his life in a moment here. Basically, though, the specialist known as Max Becker, he's pretty rude about the whole circumstance surrounding Robocop. He basically is one of those who might be against Robocop. His usage of fighting crime and rescuing the city of Detroit basically being little more than just a throwaway product of OCP themselves. But as we know from one of the chief executives, known as the Old Man, yeah, I'll have a lot to say about him later on, Robo is certainly kept under a close eye, not just by OCP or the Detroit Police Department, but by the residents of Detroit as well. Loads of people have known about him for a while now, and even some still quite admire him for his work. Some will also look to him for various services in which that us players will also get to take advantage of. For the most part, there are also a lot of optional quests. And I will say that much like how Ghostbusters, the game, had given us the idea of exploring the firehouse in the Ghostbusters films, Robocop Rogue City gives us a similar idea. We get to explore the entirety of the PD station itself. Quite literally, in fact. I mean, I've searched high and low for all sorts of different things. There's a lot of documents we get to pick up regarding various messages that have been relayed over the years. We also get to explore the server room, which is one of the main computer arteries that supplies the police department with loads of different factoids, as well as evidence and documentations regarding various crime cases and whatnot. It's a pretty big room. It's true what they said about computers filling up entire rooms back then. Well, nowadays, most of our computers can simply be stored on one little brick, like this. Quite a way to move from the past to the present. But if you're probably familiar with Robocop, chances are you might know about his 3 prime directives. Serve the public trust, protect the innocent, uphold the law. One of those prime directives does come into play in one of the first optional quests that we get to take on, in which we respond to a number of different complaints. As Robocop, we do get to take stands at the nearby podium and assist the likes of other officers whom are having trouble managing the loads of people coming into the station to file certain complaints. In my case, upon requesting and eventually answering to the complaints of 3 different people, I actually did, believe it or not, offer solutions to them. This allowed for people to, in fact, give a more positive outlook, and as a result of that, the prime directive of serve the public trust was well followed in all matters. So The thing is that Robocop serving the public trust for 3 different people was a really big move, especially from me. And I was more than satisfied with the results that I had gotten together. Of course, there are such a thing as not doing so good at serving the public trust, in which that you can probably do the exact opposite of what I did, where you could irritate the people instead. That is something optional, and it does in fact allow you to feel bad about decisions that you made. In fact, there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of responses that people will respond to whatever Robocop says or does that will in fact affect the courses of action. However, let's just say this doesn't necessarily affect the overall gameplay itself. Unlike some games that I've talked about before, where you make decisions and they can affect the rest of the game entirely, like Detroit Become Human, Robocop Rogue City doesn't exactly offer that sort of style or mechanical functionality in which that you can respond to people in different ways or complete different tasks, and it'll basically change the overall outlook or whatever is applied inside the game. Unlike Detroit Become Human, Robocop Rogue City's usage of multiple choice dialogue choices doesn't exactly comprehend to an overall outlook spectrum or whatever kind of rating system that other games might ever have. However, you are indeed given evaluation tests after various missions are completed throughout the overall main story and are given letter grades. For the most part, I've gotten B's. Ways to get A's or S's can be made possible. It all depends on how you do in the levels that you go into, the main missions that are at hand. Of course, the primary mission that we have to work with in Robocop Rogue City throughout the entire game is to find out who was responsible for handling all this nuke, distributing it, producing it, selling it, etc. But there eventually comes a point where there is a so-called Project Delta City, a supposed means of eradicating all of Detroit, cleaning up all of the mess, and rebuilding the city from the very ground up in which that it currently stands. Yeah, this supposed Delta City was apparently made as a means of attempting to rid the whole city of Detroit of all the crime that has happened thus far and all the scum that still dwells within it. But of course, as Robocop, it doesn't really matter who he follows. It doesn't really matter what he thinks about other people. While some people will indeed be conflicted or will probably give him praise for whatever he says, especially when it comes to the news anchors from Channel 9 that show up and interview with him, which do happen a few times, it's fair to say they don't necessarily affect him all that much. However, in one specific case, there is the supposed mayoral election. Yeah, it's certainly not an uncommon thing nowadays, where politics and video games happen to be correlated to each other. And in this case, the usage of the mayor being elected as a means of either changing Detroit for the better or simply leaving it as is, that technically can be made as a choice that Robocop can either take advantage of or simply leave well enough alone. Whatever case you choose, doesn't really matter for me. I mostly just stayed away from all that stuff. But going forward into the story, Soot, the leader of the Torchheads, eventually does get captured after Robocop tails him out to an old building where a concert was being held, and when Soot is eventually captured after being stressed out, basically. Yeah, you have to break a bunch of crap that's nearby. Guitars, chairs, expensive stuff, jewelry. You have to basically pick up everything in the room and destroy it. It brings his stress up to such an insanely high level. I mean, his BPM is well over 180. That would likely kill him. But he does give up and eventually allows Robocop to take him into custody. And going further, there was actually a certain figure who was dressed finely and doesn't necessarily look like the kind of guy who would run a criminal empire, but apparently he does. In fact, his appearance was so strong that Anne gets shot while Murphy, Robocop basically, ends up falling to the ground, dysfunctional. Yeah, premature shutdown, if you will. While they're both taken in, Lewis to the hospital and Robo back to the station where Robo will be evaluated, this is basically where things take a turn pretty much for the worse. You see, because this guy is eventually found out to be, believe it or not, a brother of Emil Anatowski. Yeah, you might remember Emil from the first movie when he was actually a part of Clarence Boddicker's gang. And we know that this gang was actually responsible for killing Murphy in the first place, where he would eventually be transported to OCP and upgraded into Robocop. But the thing is that while Emil was definitely killed off in the first movie, at first by nuclear waste, but then eventually getting run over by a car, this Wendell guy is apparently his brother, and is more than pissed about his brother being killed by Robo. So the whole idea of this new main antagonist in the game, whom apparently is not Max Becker, despite his opinions about OCP and Murphy himself, or about Soot, the leader of the Torchheads, because there was an entirely different gang that goes together, known as the Vultures. And this Wendell guy does have plenty more affiliation with them than he does with the Torchheads. Because remember, Soot was technically the chief of the whole operation when it came to the Torchheads' invasion of the news station and whatnot. But upon his capture, the Torchheads basically were like scattered rats. But the Vultures were more than ready for Robo. I mean, I guess you could say that the Torchheads and Vultures were sort of like hand in hand with each other. Yeah, gang fights. But in any case, though, we do go even further into the plot and eventually encounter an ex-nuke dude. Yeah, basically a nuke addict known by the name of Pickles. He apparently does become of help to us. So much so that, believe it or not, I actually do allow him to join up alongside us. Robo's belief that Pickles could actually be redeemed without him going back to his old usual ways of being a nuke addict might actually be arranged, but more on him later, as Pickles will actually be pretty crucial to the plot. Yeah, I'll have more to say about him later. But let's not forget, Robo goes further, collects more evidence, shoots down more bad guys, encounters a few bosses every now and then, including a rogue Ed 209. That is insane. It's kind of like what happened in the first movie when Ed 209 was first unveiled, and the specialist responsible for handling him apparently gets shot to pieces. Yeah, a malfunction happened. And wouldn't you know that the same thing happens here? I mean, what's going on with those Ed 209s? Why aren't they capable of doing things correctly? Like, what is going on with them? In any case, though, while the head of the Vultures does escape, and Wendell Anatowski is still on the loose, it does become clear to Robo he must take them both down, under any circumstance. We eventually are treated to a number of different storylines, a number of different side quests, saving people from burning buildings, assisting those lost finding their pets, including a cat, and even allowing for some children to do better in life. Yeah. Then, of course, there was also a rookie cop from the station. And let me tell you, this guy, he really is quite the skilled man. It's not often in which that a certain OCP personnel becomes an officer of the law, but in this case, I will say, he does actually a pretty good job at being Robocop's sidekick in this whole thing. And you would think that Lewis would actually have more involvement within this, but remember, she was shot and is recovering in the hospital, which we eventually do visit her, and the rest of the cops do also join in to cheer for her recovery. Yeah. The support in here at least is pretty wholesome, even from some other officers that weren't so nice to her. But let's remind ourselves, This movie may be full of satire, ultra-violence, drama, and all that, but at least it has its own positives that do help to balance the overall outlook of the franchise itself. And even with this, they sure do manage to not only know about the plots and character and emotions, involvements, and whatnot, they've looked into the lore on all this. I mean, these Nacon personnel sure did know the movies, as well as the TV shows. Not even the 2014 reboot with Joel Kinnaman. But in any case though, closing in further on Wendell leads us to a certain gun convention. Yeah, a lot of weapons are produced here. And we do even get to encounter yet another Ed 209. Oh, but it gets even better though. After that one's defeated and Wendell is practically taken care of here, well, boy. I mean, going into a construction site, going to the top floor where there are loads of different enemies, including Max Becker's own units, in which that Anatowski does take control of. It was a hard struggle for me to get all the way to the top. But by the time I did, those mercenaries that were not only after Robocop back in the prison where Anatowski was originally held at before he escaped and went back to his evil ways, yeah, and it basically is what leads to this epic climax of the mercenaries abandoning Wendell and Wendell having to fend off for himself. Because not only the mercenaries abandoned him, but the bots are also deactivated, thanks to some help from Becker himself. Yeah. But believe it or not, even after all that, I mean, we went through the city, we went through a prison, we went through the news station, we went through a town undergoing a riot, we went through a video store, we went through an arcade. We've done so many activities in the whole time span that we've gone through so far. And I'd say I basically went through at least 12 hours of gameplay, completing a lot of secondary objectives alongside the primary ones, as well as collecting a lot of crime evidence and even weapons and ammo. You know, because it's not only the famous Auto 9 machine pistol that Robocop famously uses in the films that you get to use, but he also does pick up other weapons. I mean, you can get a hold of magnum pistols, revolvers, assault rifles, submachine guns, heavy machine guns, and rocket launchers. Even the famous Cobra assault cannon makes it into the mix. But that doesn't happen until much later. I mean, Wendell is using some of his goons to shoot down Robocop with the Cobra assault cannon, and my gosh, that segment was hard. Like super hard. Those things just don't stop firing. Well, then again, every time I pick up one of those, there's not much ammo included. Maybe they wasted a lot of it. In any case though, you haven't really seen anything until we get to the very final scene. Because Robocop does make it back after his encounter with Wendell for the last time and defeat of Anatowski himself. And while everybody goes to celebrate, Dispatch goes in together and informs everybody that there is something going on at the OCP building. Robo immediately checks it out, goes to the top floor, and finds that there was a certain massacre up on the top. People are dead of all sorts, with shotguns and everything laying around. And eventually when Robocop makes it to the main conference room, and eventually the office in which that the old man supposedly had occupied up until he died of a heart attack, and Max Becker would supposedly become the next of kin to take over as president of OCP, well, believe it or not, Robocop 2. Yep, it's back. Robocop 2 is back. And on top of that, he chokeholds Becker to death. I mean, that's brutal right off the bat. But what's even more of a surprise is that the final boss in this instance, not just is any Robocop 2 that we encountered, it's the old man. Yeah. Never would I have ever imagined the old man of all people, would suddenly turn bad. Just like that. I mean, he dies from a heart attack sometime after he had to go to the hospital for another particular health problem of his, in which that Robo, on the same time that we visited Lewis, we also visited the old man, whom is in the more VIP section of the hospital itself. Because remember, he was at the time the president of OCP, but since he actually died from a heart attack, Becker was the next of kin to take charge. But now, neither are going to be responsible for it. It's unbelievable. I mean, Robocop 2 is already an insane load of difficult time to deal with. I mean, first of all, you got to shoot out a certain segment of his chest. It's a large circular shape that basically is what you might call the heart of Robocop 2. Shooting at it multiple times will in fact allow for his health to dwindle down, but be warned, even on the easiest difficulty, which I eventually had to go to, Robocop 2 is insanely hard to beat. I mean, pixel upon pixel upon pixel upon pixel upon pixel. It was a slow process to defeat this guy. And on top of that, he's firing multiple rockets at you from his shoulder-mounted cannon, firing at you with his minigun, and holding up floodlights at you to distract you, and launching mines that explode into the floor, causing Robo to fall to the floor below it. And there's multiple times where Robocop 2 fires at the pillars that are supposed to hold the building upright, and eventually it gets to the point where all the floors that are blown and all the support elements that are hit will cause the building itself to collapse. But we eventually get to the point where Robo and Robo 2 fall all the way to the parking garage down below. This is supposedly the final segment of the battle right here. And I'll be honest with you, I never could make it past that section. I had to give up. Had no other choice. So Robocop 2, by my own account at least, was undefeated. Just to know the fact that this is the old man you're fighting, a man whom has basically been on your side the whole time, is outrageous. So, I can't really say that this is going to affect my overall scoring of the game itself. It's an incredible twist. I mean, that'd be like if, let's say, the next time there's a Justice League movie that came around and many sequels would follow up until the very last one where Superman becomes evil. That'd be one crazy twist. Probably one of the most outrageous things. But in all sense, I will say that everything that I've had to talk about in regards to RoboCop Rogue City does at least chalk up to a number of different benefactors here. I mean, there's first-person shooter action that takes place, lots of dialogue, lots of characters, both old and new, which can allow for you to expand the world of RoboCop even further. There's a lot of new elements, including some new weapons that you can get. There's also lots of plots that you can work with. There's also the many locations that were visited over the years by RoboCop in the films, the shows, and all that stuff. So this does allow for us to have a much broader perspective of what kind of world RoboCop existed in. Because this wasn't just any Detroit that we were living in. This was RoboCop's own Detroit. Yeah. It was a far different depiction than what we had known back then. But let's be real here. I was more than happy about what I had seen throughout the whole course of the gameplay entirely. More than 12 hours worth of runtime, which by my assessment still is a bit short. If it were at least 20, that'd be fine for a new PS5 entry, especially if it's considered exclusive to the PS5 and whatnot. But all things considered, I do love this game. It probably is going to be, let's say, top 10 best PS5 exclusive games, from my own perspective at least. I'm sure that I would have to create a top 10 PS5 exclusives countdown list of some sorts, but that might have to wait for a little while. But I will say, 2023 was probably one of the best years for gaming thus far. I mean, and I've talked about a lot. There was Train Sim World 4, there was Dredge, there were SpongeBob SquarePants and the Cosmic Shake, there was Daymare 1994 Sandcastle, Hellboy Web of Weird, You Suck at Parking. Then there was also Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 Retold. And then you have this, Robocop Rogue City. In terms of scoring, we're going to give it a solid 8.5 out of 10.1. Certainly no level of masterpiece quality, considering the fact that the animation felt a bit cheap, but still passable considering the fact that this is PS5 standards. And also, I will say, the acting done here was also pretty decent, but is nowhere near, let's say, masterpiece level. There's lots of F-bombs dropped, so I would not recommend this to anyone who might have a faint of heart or even faint of mind, considering how much trickery this could do to you mentally. Especially when you get to know about the certain past that Murphy himself has experienced up until the days where he became the one and only Robocop himself. So, with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this piece, and I sure will have plenty more to offer when it comes to HJN Super Graphics. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.